What if I told you that the so-called strong Viking woman often had no choice over her own life? We imagine Viking women as fearless, independent, and respected. But behind the legends, behind the shields and sagas, was a brutal truth of forced marriages, silent suffering, and survival at any cost. So why are Viking women praised as powerful when their marriages were built on control, fear, and violence? And what really happened inside Viking homes after the longships sailed away?
The Viking world was not a place of romance. It was a world of cold winters, short summers, and constant danger. Scandinavia, between the 8th and 11th centuries, was harsh and unforgiving. Rocky land, frozen soil, long months of darkness. Survival was never guaranteed. In this brutal environment, family was not about love, it was about staying alive. Every person had a role. Men hunted, farmed, traded, and raided. But women, Viking women, were the hidden backbone of this society. They cooked, cleaned, farmed, raised children, wove clothing, preserved food, and managed households while men were gone for months, sometimes years. If a woman failed, the family failed. If the family failed, everyone starved. This is why marriage was not optional, it was essential. Not marrying meant isolation, and isolation meant death. Viking society was deeply structured. At the top were the jarls, the wealthy elites. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves often captured during raids. A woman's fate depended entirely on which class she was born into. A jarl's daughter could be married for power. A carl's daughter was married for labor and survival. A thrall woman had no choice at all. She was property. No matter the class, marriage decided everything. Who she lived with, what work she did, how many children she was expected to bear, and whether her life would be protected or disposable. This was the Viking world. Not heroic, not romantic, just raw survival. Viking marriages were not built on love stories. They were contracts, legal agreements negotiated between families, almost always by men. A young girl, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, had little say in who she would marry. Her father, brothers, or male guardians made the decision. Consent existed in theory, but refusing was nearly impossible. Saying no could mean being disowned, or worse, labeled dishonorable. And in Viking society, honor was everything. Marriage negotiations involved payments. The groom paid a bride price, silver, land, livestock, to the bride's family. This wasn't a gift, it was compensation. In return, the bride's family provided a dowry, often household goods or property. On paper, this system protected women. In reality, it turned them into valuable assets. The more valuable the bride, the less freedom she had. Marriage wasn't about happiness, it was about alliances, wealth, and survival. Viking weddings were loud, dramatic, and deeply symbolic. Animals were sacrificed to the gods. Blood was spilled to ensure fertility. Thor's hammer was placed in the bride's lap as a blessing. Feasting lasted for days. Ale flowed freely. Songs were sung. Promises were spoken aloud. But when the fire died down and the guests left, reality began. The bride was expected to move into her husband's home, leave behind her family, her childhood, her identity. That night marked the end of her freedom. The Viking longhouse was the center of daily life. Smoke filled the air. Animals slept nearby. Privacy did not exist. For Viking wives, the work never stopped. They woke before dawn. They cooked, spun wool, wove cloth, repaired clothing, tended fields, and raised children, often alone, because Viking men were frequently gone, raiding, trading, fighting wars. Women became the managers of entire households. But authority did not mean equality.
By law, a Viking husband was the head of the household. He controlled property, he controlled decisions, and in many cases, he controlled punishment. Physical discipline was culturally accepted. If a man beat his wife, society rarely interfered unless it caused public shame or death. Pain inside the home was considered private. A woman's silence was expected. Marriage came with unspoken rules. A wife was expected to provide heirs. Sons were especially valuable. Refusing intimacy was not an option. Men could take lovers. Men could sleep with slave women. Women could not. If a woman was accused of adultery, the consequences were severe. Public humiliation, loss of honor, divorce without support, or even death. The rules were not equal. They were never meant to be. Many Viking women lived their entire lives bound to men they did not choose. Some adapted, some endured, some broke silently. The sagas praise strong women, but they rarely tell us how many cried quietly in the dark, how many feared the sound of footsteps at night, how many lived only because survival demanded it. And yet, with everything, they endured. Viking marriage was not a fairy tale. It was a battlefield, without weapons, without escape. And for women, the greatest strength was not power, it was survival.
Modern stories love the image of the Viking woman as fearless and powerful. She stands beside warriors. She carries a sword. She commands respect. But history is not a movie. The truth is more complicated and far more uncomfortable. The power Viking women actually had. Yes, Viking women had more rights than many women in medieval Europe. They could own property, inherit land, run farms and businesses, represent the household when men were away. When a husband left on a raid, the wife became the authority of the home. She managed food stores, she directed workers, she controlled keys, the symbol of household power. In sagas, women are often described as wise, sharp-tongued, and strong-willed. But this power had limits, very clear limits. The illusion of equality. A woman's authority existed only within the home. Outside it, the world belonged to men. She could manage property, but usually couldn't sell it freely. She could speak, but her word carried less weight than a man's. She could lead, but only if society allowed it. And if she challenged male authority too openly, she paid a price. Strength was respected. Obedience was required. Divorce, freedom or myth? One of the most surprising facts about Viking women is that they could legally divorce. But this doesn't mean divorce was easy. A woman could request divorce for reasons like physical abuse, lack of financial support, sexual neglect, public humiliation. To do this, she had to publicly declare her reasons, often in front of witnesses. That alone was dangerous. After divorce, a woman might regain her dowry, or she might be left with nothing. A divorced woman carried social shame. Remarriage was possible, but never guaranteed. For many, divorce meant poverty. So yes, divorce existed, but freedom? Rare. Shield maidens, legend or reality? Stories speak of shield maidens, women warriors who fought beside men. Some archaeological graves show women buried with weapons. Some sagas describe fierce female fighters. But these cases were exceptions, not the rule. Most Viking women never held a sword. They fought battles of endurance, not combat. The shield maiden became a legend because she was rare. History remembers her, but forgets the millions who never escaped the longhouse. To understand Viking marriage fully, we must face the darkest truth. Not all women were wives. Many were captives. Women taken during raids. Viking raids were brutal. Villages were burned. Men were killed. Women were taken. Captured women were brought back to Scandinavia as slaves or forced wives.
They had no legal protection, no voice, no choice. Some were married off, others were used as concubines. Their past lives were erased. Thrall women, lives without rights. Thrall women were slaves. Female thralls lived at the mercy of their owners. They could be beaten, sold, raped, forced to bear children. Children born to thrall women were also slaves. A thrall woman's body did not belong to her, not legally, not socially, not morally. Even if a thrall was freed, the trauma followed her. History rarely records their names, but their suffering built Viking wealth. Violence behind closed doors. Domestic violence existed in Viking society, and it was tolerated. As long as a man did not bring shame upon himself, what happened inside the home was ignored. A woman who complained risked being blamed. Enduring pain was seen as strength. Speaking out was seen as weakness. Silence became survival. Sexual control and fear. A woman's sexuality was tightly controlled. Virginity before marriage mattered. Faithfulness after marriage was enforced. A rumor could destroy a woman's life. Accusations of adultery could lead to public shaming, divorce without support, social exile, death. Men faced few consequences. Honor belonged to men. Shame belonged to women. Viking society was ruled by law, but the law did not protect everyone equally. Honor above all else. Honor was the foundation of Norse culture. A man's honor defined his status. A woman's honor defined her value. If a woman was dishonored by assault, rumor, or accusation, the blame often fell on her. Justice focused on restoring male honor, not healing female suffering. Women in Norse law codes. Norse laws mention women, but rarely center them. Women were protected as property, as daughters, as wives, but not as independent individuals. If a woman was harmed, compensation was paid to her male guardian. Her pain became a transaction. When the law failed. If a husband abused his wife, the law intervened only if she died or the abuse became publicly known. Many women endured in silence. The law was not blind. It was shaped by power, and power belonged to men. Closing line for Part 6. Viking women lived in a world that praised strength but demanded submission. They were respected but controlled, protected but owned. And the greatest injustice of all is that history remembered their strength but forgot their suffering.
By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Viking world began to change. The longships still sailed, but the old gods were fading. A new force was spreading across Scandinavia: Christianity. As Christianity took root, Viking customs slowly shifted. Polygamy began to disappear. Forced marriages faced more limits. Marriage became a religious bond, not just a contract. On the surface, this looked like progress, but for many women, change came slowly. Church law still favored men. Wives were still expected to obey. Female sexuality was still controlled, only now in the name of God, not the gods. The chains changed shape. They did not disappear. As Viking society transformed, something else happened. Women vanished from history. Christian monks wrote the records. Male scholars preserved the sagas. Women's stories were filtered, rewritten, or erased. The pain of wives, the suffering of slaves, the silence of daughters. It was never considered important enough to record. History chose warriors over widows, battles over births, kings over mothers. Centuries later, the Viking Age was reborn in stories.
Paintings showed powerful women standing proudly beside warriors. Modern media celebrated shield maidens and fearless queens. But these images tell only part of the truth. They ignore forced marriages, domestic abuse, sexual slavery, silent endurance. The real Viking woman was not a symbol, she was a survivor. What strength really meant. Viking women were strong, not because they held swords, but because they endured lives they did not choose in a world that rarely protected them. They raised children alone. They managed homes in constant fear. They survived violence, loss, and silence. Their strength was invisible, and that made it easy to forget. So what is the brutal truth about Viking marriage and women? It is this: Viking women were neither free heroines nor helpless victims. They lived between power and pain. Marriage was survival, not romance. Strength was endurance, not freedom. Honor was demanded, but rarely returned. They built families. They sustained society. They held the Viking world together. Yet history remembered the men who conquered and forgot the women who endured. Behind every Viking warrior was a woman who waited, who worked, who suffered, who survived. Her story was never sung in battle halls. Her pain was never carved into rune stones. But without her, there would have been no Vikings at all. So the next time you hear about the power of Viking women, ask yourself this: was it strength or was it survival in a brutal world that gave them no other choice?